Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello, everybody. It's Billy and Andrew with our 360 Money Matters podcast, and we're back here today talking about planning financially for children.
Yes. Sorry, I'm laughing just because that was the third attempt that Billy made to make that introduction. So apologies for that. But yes, we're back with another podcast and we're talking about all things planning financially for children. It's a pretty big topic, I think. Maybe it's just a topic in my circumstances, being in your late 20s and most of your friends and people around you are having kids and are asking questions around saving money for kids and putting money away. But yet, today's podcast is all about the financial plans for having kids and the steps and things that you can put in place for that.
Andrew, been there, am in there, understand well and truly how, I guess, expensive it can be raising children. The expenses that you do incur, sort of expected, but there's stuff that comes out of left field. I remember going to Woolworths multiple times a week to buy nappies, and the amount of money that we were spending was absolutely ridiculous. But the one key thing that I think was imperative and definitely helped out us was being able to plan for some of these things. And even if you don't know what's coming down the path, how much things are going to cost, I think if you've got a plan and you're putting something towards or a strategy towards that, even if you don't get it 100% right, you're going to offset some of the impact of it as well too. So I guess there's really two main things that we think about in terms of planning for children. It's the increased expenses from a day-to-day perspective. And then the other stuff, which is probably more relevant to the clients that we're talking to, is about some of the larger expenses that are associated with raising a family.
Yeah, exactly right. As Billy said, there's really two main considerations. One is making the adjustments to your day-to-day budget, making the adjustments to make sure that that surplus income, that investable money is still there. And really the things that we delve into a large amount of detail with clients is the larger expenses and making plans and steps towards that. And those larger expenses, they can vary. There are some similarities in a lot of different strategies and a lot of different scenarios. You think about future planning for purchasing a car for when they turn 18 years old, or a house deposit because property prices are going absolutely bananas at the moment in Melbourne. You talk about university fees, education costs for private schooling. Like, there's some really big expenses that can happen and that can pop up, not out of left field, but fairly quickly once the penny drops and once the little one's out. There's some fairly large expenses that need some accounting for.
And some of those things that you spoke about, Andrew, are longer term in nature. But some of the things that hit home quickly, and we realised this in our particular circumstance, that when we had Andre and he was a baby, we had a fairly small car at that particular point in time. So we actually needed to upgrade our car almost immediately because we couldn't fit the capsule in the back, and that was a whole disaster within itself. But that was something that we should have probably anticipated, but had to happen pretty much straight away. And then the other thing that we experienced, especially when we had our second child and Scarlett came along, is the house that we were living in was becoming too small for a growing family. Even though that wasn't an immediate impact, that was something that was approaching and we needed to upgrade the family home. So with something like that, tends to come around a lot faster than I guess you realise. And the sooner we can start planning for those things, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not every child is planned to the nth degree, and you don't know a lot of the times when it's going to happen, and it can sometimes take longer or shorter than expected. But really having a good idea around what are the things that we are going to need to do? What are the things that we're going to need to do, as Billy said immediately? Like, are we going to need to upgrade the family car? What's the best method in order to facilitate doing that? Do you take out a car loan? Do you purchase with money that you have in savings? Are you going to need to upgrade the family home? There's certainly those immediate considerations that are going to have an impact not only to the everyday cash flow position, but also the asset position from a household perspective. And then above and beyond that, there's the other longer term in nature expenses that you probably have a better line of sight of. There's the things that we were talking about a little bit earlier, like buying a car when they turn 18, deposit for a house, private school fees, university fees. How do you account for those? How do you put away an amount of money? I mean, very common question that we get asked, do you just open up a bank account and put an amount of money in for them and it's like savings for them? What's the best way to do it, Billy? How do you account for it?
Probably one of the most common questions that we get from people or clients that we're dealing with that have either just started a family or are thinking about it. Really getting a clear line of sight in terms of timing. So I think that's critically important, because the things that are a bit longer term in nature, you can take a different approach, and that's more around the investing route, like what we've spoken about in previous podcasts, where you're investing a set amount of money and over a longer period of time, and that will compound and grow. But I think the common theme with all of these is getting line of sight as to what those expenses are, figuring out how much time you've got before you incur them, put a dollar value on them as well too, and then start working backwards and reverse engineering essentially how much time you've got and how much money you need to contribute in order to meet or at least offset some of those future expenses that are going to happen. And that sounds pretty simplistic in nature, but when you're starting to think about having a family, or you've just had first child or whatever it may be, at least in our instance, that wasn't necessarily front of mind for us. So while it seems like a fairly simple concept, it's not necessarily something that's on your radar at that particular point in time. And the other consideration as well too is you've got things like a member of the family or both members of the family may take time off work in order to raise the child. So there may be instances where the household income is fluctuating as well.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And I think that's the key takeaway that I take from what you just said, Bills, is really deciding on, before you decide on the right type of how do you do it and what's the vehicle in order to facilitate the savings mechanism, is what are we aiming for? Once the little one goes to high school, you want to start paying for private school fees, and what time frame are we talking about, which should be fairly easy, but what are the costs associated? Is it 15 grand a year? Is it 5 grand a year? Is it 30 grand a year? I mean, what's going to be the requirement of assets in order to facilitate that? Are you wanting to give them a deposit for a house of 20 grand or 50 or 100, or what amount of money are we aiming towards? And then we can work out the facility on how to do it. So really, as with anything, and I know we've spoken about it so many times on the podcast, but first deciding on the goal and what we're trying to achieve is the key before deciding on the right financial product to help you get there.
Absolutely, Andrew. And the other thing too is it's really challenging, and with our children as well too, because that private school thing is something that we want to do. Trying to determine what a future education cost is going to cost in, especially if you start thinking about it when they're born. But if it's high school, what's that, 12 years to high school when they're about 12? You're trying to pick a target that's going to start in 12 years' time. Can be quite challenging. So there's a little bit of science and a little bit of art to it. Ultimately, what I've experienced is you don't need to get it 100% right. I mean, even if you manage to achieve 80 or 90% of your target, you've still done an extremely good job to alleviate that pressure that you're going to feel at that particular point in time from that expense coming up. That was one of the challenges that we found in particular with our circumstances, is trying to figure out and determine and plan for something that's going to be obviously more expensive in the future, but it's such a long way away. So that was a challenge from our perspective. And every time I look at it, we're not there yet. He's not at that age yet, but every time I look at it, it seems to be getting more and more expensive every year. So that's an interesting one as well.
And that's, again, once you've determined this is the goal and this is what we're trying to achieve, whether that number's $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever the asset pool needs to be at a predetermined point in time, then you can start to look at the various options that are available. So talk us through, Billy, take us through a couple of the options that may be available if someone is wanting to put an amount of money. Then we can sort of start to flush out what are the benefits of each, what are the alternatives, and how do we actually go about determining what's the right vehicle to facilitate this savings for the future planned expenses.
I might break it down into the longer term and the shorter term. Just like any investing principles, you want to figure out your time frame. But if we're dealing with something that's longer term in nature, like an education cost that we're going to incur in high school, so 12 years away, or we want to fund university, or we want to buy our child a car when they're 18. From that perspective, you can really take advantage of your time in the market. So with instances like that, I'd be looking at some sort of investment vehicle. We've spoken about that time and time again, but you don't want to enter into something like that if your time frame is short-term in nature. So like I said, the first thing that I'd really concentrate on is the length of the time frame that you've got. And if it is longer term in nature, I'd be investing in something like, a share portfolio, an investment portfolio, some managed funds. There's other investment products out there, which we might do a deeper dive in another episode, like growth bonds or investment bonds, I should say, as they're well known. And that's a specific investment vehicle and a tax structure that's designed to help provide families with a future education cost in particular is what we see with our clients. So that's how I'd think about that from that perspective. Is it short-term in nature? Is it long-term in nature? And then if you're dealing with something that's short-term in nature, you really don't want to expose that money to any investment risk, because if you do get the timing wrong and the markets do go down and you need to access that money, you've obviously ended up with less money than what you've started. You don't have time to recover from that perspective. So if it's something that's short-term in nature, what I would be doing is probably just using a savings account. Not that we can really get much interest out of those, but that's how I'd be differentiating between the two, long-term or short-term in nature.
Yeah, and completely agree with you. I mean, the important thing to consider within all of this is also, in any investment, you make a decision around your tolerance to risk. What we generally find for most clients is there is some form of sentimental attachment to the amount of money that you're putting away for your kids. It's, whether you recognize that to begin with or whether you recognize that at a future point in time, it's important to consider, how do you rate your risk and how do you want to invest money that's designed for your children? For some people, that's exactly the same as how they'd invest their money personally. For other people, that's different. So it's important to really take that into consideration. And when we start talking about those different types of investment vehicles, like a savings account, like a investment bond or growth bond, as Billy said, like a share portfolio, whatever the asset is, it's important to consider the flexibility within those types of investments. So, a share portfolio is generally a little bit longer term in nature, as Billy said, because you want to ride the periods of up and down and you don't want to be exposed to just short-term fluctuations. An investment or a growth bond can have some tax benefits associated with it. However, can have some limitations in relation to how much money you can put into it on a yearly basis. There are some limits with that. And so determining the right type of asset holding, it's important to really look at the broader context and really look at what it is that you're trying to save for and what it is that you're trying to achieve off the back of these funds.
Well said, Andrew. And to elaborate on that a little bit more, different investment structures and investment vehicles and investment options have different cost structures associated with it. So once again, there may be transaction costs in order to get into a particular investment. So you need to take that into consideration. There may be liquidity issues with particular investments as well, or different types of structures. But all of those, once again, comes down to really thinking of this with the end in mind and reverse engineering your position from that perspective and trying to figure out what is the best course of action in order to save for those future expenses.
Yeah, exactly right. And the other thing to consider is it doesn't need to be a one approach. When you're putting funds away for a child, I would almost look at it like a separate entity. So developing separate goals from the household goals and developing a separate investment plan for those funds. So you almost separate that out from an investment side of things and look at, okay, what in this environment, what are, as Billy said, the short, the medium, the long-term goals, and what are the vehicles in order to facilitate that? So once you sort of break it out, break the funds out and develop what it is that you're trying to achieve, it doesn't need to be that all of the funds that I have are going into this, one bank account. It can be a approach of, all right, all of the money that's designed for this child goes into a bank account. And then off the back of that bank account, there's a whole heap of investment strategies and a whole heap of vehicles in order to achieve and do different things in order to achieve those goals.
Yeah, and we find that it's always Well, not always, but the majority of the time it's a combination of a few things. I know in our instance, there's a couple of different strategies that we've got. The most simple and probably the most common one is having a bank account for our kids. And that's so the grandparents during Christmas or their birthdays or anything, they can deposit some money into those things and help out the kids from that perspective. And then from our point of view, as in the parents, we're doing a different strategy from an investment perspective to try and get to a position where when those bigger expenses do come around for our children, hopefully we can offset all of those costs, but if not, we can take a large chunk out of those and it won't be as impactful for the household and the budget. Once again, it's usually a combination of few things from our perspective when we're going through this with clients. But I'd say the thing that's probably the most common that we talk about and with everyone, and we try and encourage all of our clients to do, is to plan as early as they possibly can for this stuff. And if we're looking at it from a time frame that's long in nature, it really gives us the best chance and the best opportunity that we've got to be able to maximize the position that we're going to be in at that future point in time.
Exactly right. And that goes with absolutely everything that you're doing from an investment perspective. The more that you can do, the longer the time frame, the less risk that you need to take on, the less that you need to do in order to be able to get there. So plan is really just the key takeaway. Develop what those goals are. Once you've developed what those goals are for those expenses or what those expenses are going to be, then you can work out what's the best strategy in order to get there.
Well said, Andrew, and I think that's a good summary of everything that we've spoken about today. Yeah, planning financially for children. Start early, plan. The longer that you've got, the easier it will become. But one of the consistent things from our perspective is even if you can't get to exactly your goal, getting close and doing something is better than doing nothing at all. So the earlier you can start thinking about it, the more specific you can be with that particular goal. The time frame is crucial, and if we can reverse engineer that, we can put a really good plan together to help people with those costs.
Yeah, very well summarized, Billy. Love it.
Well, that's about it from our end. I hope our listeners got a fair bit out of today. And like always, if there's anything that you wanted to talk to us about, please feel free to reach out. We've got those details in the show notes.
Yeah, thanks very much for listening. Really appreciate it and looking forward to bringing the next podcast.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.